how to choose the best middle school literature for your homeschooled child. Today, I'm going to be sharing a list of questions, and I'll help you with the answers too. But these questions are a lot more helpful than all the overwhelming amount of lists for middle schoolers out there, what they're supposed to be reading in homeschool. But first, my name is Tina Robertson. I've homeschooled over 20 years. I have 3 homeschooled grads from the beginning to end, high school, even college, young adult. I'm mentoring Mr. Munchkin right now. He's pre-K, kindergarten, maybe some first grade work in there. It's so much fun. But anyway, I love homeschooling. I've been in the homeschooling world for a while, and I want to share my seasoned tips with you when it comes to picking out middle school literature. My site is Tina's Dynamic Homeschool Plus. Be sure you're following me over there too. And when I finish with this video, I'll post some links too in the comments, which will help you. So, like I was explaining earlier, there are a lot of lists for middle schoolers to give you choices. How are we supposed to pick? Well, instead of giving you another list of literature or books, I want to share some tips that work for me and how to weigh the literature, what I'm looking for, my goal, because sometimes we're like, what do we do at this age? Because really, middle school is where we always heard the term, we are teaching our kids to read. They are learning to read. Well, long about middle school, a little bit earlier, it switches to reading to learn. That's a huge difference. First, we're teaching them how to read and they're focusing on the sounds and the sentences. Well, now they moved into this next stage of development and they're usually pretty opinionated and have a lot to say. Now we want to feed their mind. We're past that initial stage of the struggling how to read. Now they're reading to learn. And that is the focus in middle school on into high school, and then, of course, on into being an adult. And when you think about that, that influences how we choose literature. So, one of the questions, the first question that you want to ask yourself, or that I did, is should I read every book my child reads? And if you're like me and you have multiple kids and readers who love to read, you're like, whoa, that's not even possible. How's that going to happen? Or sometimes we have readers that don't like to read so much. So, what are we supposed to do? Well, the answer is complicated, but it's both yes and no. But let me tell you why. Because your purpose determines whether or not you read the book that you have looked at, because usually middle school is where you start literature analysis. This is a higher level of thinking. It's a critical thinking ability. It's to get the child to understand the author's view, the plot. We want to see those lines, those storylines. They're going beyond what the surface is, and at this age, reader, a child can do that. So to answer your question, if you're just looking for books or literature for enjoyment and to read, no, you don't have to read every book. But it's hard to do literature analysis where it starts in middle school. I wouldn't do it any earlier than middle school because they're not ready and they'll have plenty of time to do literature analysis in high school. So the purpose then of looking at a book or deciding a book then is for the beginning stages of literature analysis. And it's hard to teach that if you're not familiar with the book. Now, there's a site that I would go to many years. It's called Banned and Challenged Books because, as homeschoolers, we don't want to be told what our kids should read. That's our decision to make. That's your decision to make. But that site, I know it will list something, and you can decide if that theme or that sub-theme or topic you would find objectionable. So if it comes to analysis, you do want to be familiar with it. So that's the first question. When you're building the literature for them for middle school, then how many of these books are going to be for analysis versus just enjoyment? If it's enjoyment, pick out how many ever books to the delight. The point I'm making is that if you're using it for credit or even some for high school credit at this point, then you do want to be picky about which books you pick out for literature analysis. And that's why I say the answer is complicated to that question, yes and no. So it depends on your purpose. Okay, so then that brings me to the next question that's helpful than all these lists that you can choose and you can peruse to your heart's delight. The second question then is, how many books or literature should my child read each year? Well, again, another subjective answer. Some homeschool educators have a background in language arts and they're heavy into language arts. Others, not so much. So I just use a general rule of thumb with each of my kids as they hit the middle school and the high school years. And that is usually about 4 to 6 books I found was a comfortable guideline with books we discussed. Now, again, I just want to be sure this is clear so it's not misunderstood. And that is, this is not all that they read for the year. They can certainly read, and mine did, way more than the 4 to 6 books a year. But if they don't like to read and they don't want to, you're thinking, what's a good rule of thumb? 4 to 6. 4 to 6. And these are the books also, when I say 4 to 6, these are the ones that we discussed. They would write their essays from. We would discuss the author's viewpoint. These are books that I was familiar with as well. So 4 to 6 to count as credit. And the rest of them, it really doesn't matter. It's your teen's choice, whatever type of literature that they enjoy. But that really is a realistic amount. I know that when I first started planning for middle school, I had like 8 or 10. I was like, there was no way we're going to get through that for a year and be able to discuss them, because that's the point of the literature, is to be able to discuss the books. What do they think? What's their opinion? That's how we teach that next level, that higher critical thinking, how to weigh a book, look at the author's viewpoint. Do we agree? Do we not agree with it? What are they, what's he or she trying to tell us in this book without saying the words? The analysis, the getting familiar with the characters, the type of genre it is, fiction, figures of speech. It's hard to cover those beginning elements of literature analysis with any more books than that. It really isn't how many you cover, it's how much you talk about each one. That has been my experience. That gets that discussion going. That gets my teen's blood boiling if he doesn't agree with the book. That's all that I'm trying to accomplish with the literature. So you can see there's 2 purposes. There's enjoyment of the literature, and then there's the analysis to get to that point. So that's why I say about 4 to 6 books or even less. Okay, so then the next question then, when it comes to picking out literature, this is the other question that you want to ask about middle school. Do I want my child to integrate other subjects or skills with that literature, or standalone, or to have it standalone? Now, my preference, because I like to teach skinny, meaning get as many subjects into one book as I can, is I prefer to integrate as I can. Now, my sons could choose their books. We discussed each year, and some of them they didn't get to choose because I was like, we're going to talk about this book. But most of them were their choice. But I want to integrate other subjects, because as the middle school, high school years kind of around the corner, so you want to start in middle school kind of streamlining, making always a skinny lady if you can with curriculum. And also, when you integrate the subjects, they just make so much more sense. Another reason to integrate a subject, when I mean integrate, I mean like history or science into your literature, is that If a child, perhaps he likes history and he doesn't like reading so much, you've combined one subject he doesn't like with something that he does like. So that makes him able to go ahead and feel like he's accomplishing something. It just makes it easier to swallow when you do that. So, for example, we use Beautiful Feet in middle school and high school. I love the literature provider because they're living books. They're books that are not textbooks. They make learning come alive, but we are both counting reading, literature, and history all at once instead of all these multiple subjects that we lay upon a teen or a high schooler. That's how you keep it a skinny lady. They're like, how do you get so many subjects in one time? Well, we get them in because we're reading about history or we're reading about famous scientists, and that's our reading, and that is our science. Does that make sense? That's a great tip too, because people are wondering, how my teen has so many subjects. Well, why is the book separate from their history? Why is the book separate from science? Why is the book separate from art? So think about that too. Do you want to integrate? And sometimes some books you just can't integrate. They're just good reads. So I always wanted, if we're going to read something, take the time to read, we're going to learn history or science, another subject, and count that as history or science. So think about that too when it comes to picking, literature out. How can I get more bang for my buck, so to speak, or your teen's time, especially if they don't like one or the other subject. If they don't like reading, or they don't like history, or they don't like science or something, you can put one subject they like with one that they don't. Kind of makes it go down a little bit easier. Okay, so then the next question after that, and like I said, I like combining as much as I can. The next question 4 that I have, is should I require my child to write book reports? Okay. When I was in school, book reports was just considered busy work. And I promised my kids would never do a book report. Well, I had to eat my words, because here's why. See, book reports can be used by public school and even some homeschoolers just as busy work. They have to have a purpose. There has to be a purpose for them. So no, I did not give my kids book reports in 3rd grade. The reason for the book report, as I homeschooled longer and got to understand the development of a child and how they learn and the higher thinking skills, the reason for a book report is that it's a blueprint to literature analysis in high school. Did they write a book report on every 4 to 6 books? No, they didn't. In middle school, really, they only wrote maybe 1 or 2 book reports. That was it. That was enough to tell me that they grasped these beginning literature analysis points, like figure of speech, grammar, the English language. They start to understand it, and they're diving beyond the surface. 1 or 2 was good enough for me each year. And like I said, it wasn't because I wanted to destroy their love of learning of the book, which is another tip. And I heard this from Susan Weissbauer years ago when she started her homeschool journey, because I had started off with the classical approach. And then, of course, as you know, I switched to the unit study approach because we love the mastery approach. And I love integrating as many subjects together as I can because it makes more sense to cover them together. But she said, if there is a book that your child loves and they love to read, for all that is good and dear, do not make that one your literature analysis. That's not the one that you want to discuss and puree and mutilate and dissect. Use a book that's just so-so. Your child still gets the same. It might be a little bit boring, but don't destroy the love of learning for a book that you love or that your child is loving. And that happened to me before. We started off reading one that was supposed to be for literature analysis, but we loved it so much we just couldn't do that to the book. It was just supposed to be loved and just put away. I didn't want to discuss it and break it down and mull over it with my teens. It was just a book they were going to hold dear. And so I really appreciate that tip from her, and I put it into practice for the 20 years that I did. And so I'm here to tell you, if it's a book they end up loving, don't do that. Find a book that's not so much fun. And another tip I learned is that you really don't have to use a book that's middle school level for literature analysis. That's just a side tip. You can always just use a younger grade picture book. And I did that when I started off in high school. Now, you're not counting it, obviously, for literature, but that's just a side tip. We'll talk more about that in another video. But for all that is good and dear, do not use a literature book that you've read, or, read a story that you fall in love with it, that your team's like, this is the best book ever. Oh, please don't do that to it. Find something else. But back to the book report. My kids didn't do them in the younger grades. But when they got to middle school, I could see that it was kind of a blueprint, like I said, to teaching them how to write that essay, to put their thoughts down on paper, to compose their thoughts, not only in their mind, but on paper, about what they thought about this book to enter into the great discussion of life. And so I did a couple of them in middle school. It's up to you whether or not, because remember, the emphasis on book reports is not on the writing, the penmanship. They can even do it oral. The emphasis on the book report is the content of the book. It's weighing, what did the author mean? Do I understand fiction, nonfiction? Do I understand these elements, characters, the rise and the fall of the plot, the climax? Different elements like this. These are the things that they want to talk about in the book report. And then you can see, are they picking these out? Do they understand them? Because this is an introductory. They don't master it in the middle school literature analysis. That doesn't come to high school. This is where you're both having them continue the love of learning. That's why they are reading to learn, to love the book, and also to analyze it. That's what they're doing. Okay, so if you want to do something like, if it's oral, you can say, here's some questions that I have rounded up. And these are questions like I would ask my kids, or I would give them to do in a book report. Was it better that? What do you think? Blah, blah, blah. In your opinion. See, this guides them to that higher level. They have to really think. They have to have an opinion. It's not just, let me see if I can get something and copy it from the book. You want to know what they think. There's not really right or wrong answers. You're wanting them to make connections in the book, tie points. How is blank tied in or related to blank? How would you change the character to blank? What choice would you have made if blah, blah, blah? See, these are open-ended questions that, continues that conversation with your middle schooler. It helps them to think beyond just what they said in the book. Look, underneath. Okay, so those were the questions that I want to share with you. They were a lot more helpful, like I said, instead of just all these lists. I do have a list. I'll post it down there. But just remember, here's the questions. Should I read the book? The answer is yes and no. It depends, remember, on the purpose, or at least be familiar with it. Have a summary of it if you do it. Then how many should my middle school read that you count as credit? This is not all the reading they do for the year. Goodness sakes. I know some that can read twice that and more for the year. So I'm talking about analysis. These are the books you actually have to spend time. So don't make the number so big, especially if you have a lot of kids. It's harder to have that one-to-one time with them to see what they think about it. So 4 to 6, even if you have to lower it, even if you do 3. One year I had to do 3 because I had 2 older ones hit me at one time and they both were reading a lot. And so one year I just did 3, but I knew that they were reading. Okay. And then the next question, the third question is then, do you want to integrate do you want to add or integrate the other subjects with reading? So that's the other reason to think about, the type of book that you want to choose. Is it, like I said, we had used Beautiful Feet. There's other providers too. It's both history and reading. And if you do an analysis, you're doing a little bit of analysis, literature, and history. So do you want to add or combine other subjects? So when you pick books, think about that too. What other subject can they learn from this book just besides reading? Because a lot of homeschoolers will saddle their middle schoolers with a lot of literature. And I'm like, well, why are you reading? Well, what are you reading this book? I can see if it's for enjoyment, but maybe you can add a little history, a little science, a little art, composers, nature. Can you get a twofer? I call them twofer. Can you get 2 subjects in there with the book? And then the next question to say, do you really need to do a book report? That's up to you. We just did a couple of them and I realized it helped my kids, and we didn't do them in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, none of those. We did them. We did them closer to 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade. is when I really did with my middle school kids. And I just did a couple of them because I wanted them to be able to form their thoughts. I wanted to put them down on paper before we hit high school because, like I said, the book reports are a blueprint then for higher thinking abilities and for high school analysis when that comes around in literature. So that's the way I chose literature. I have some lists that I'm going to put down at the bottom when this video is over, and that way it can help you some. And I hope those questions will help you to weigh and how to choose. There's so much stuff out there to choose. So I hope that helps you. And until next time, bye.